Before you close this moment and return to everything waiting for you, imagine that somewhere tonight, beneath a quiet lamp and the soft glow of a window, someone is sitting alone with a piece of paper in front of them. They have already written your name. They stared at it for a long time before adding another word. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because there are some feelings that become frightening when they are finally given a name. Their hand paused above the page. They almost folded the letter and put it away. Almost. But then they remembered something you once said. Something so ordinary that you probably forgot it. They didn't. And that memory is the reason the letter exists. This is a fictional spiritual story, imagined as though a loving heavenly voice were inviting you to notice what the human heart sometimes hides. So don't listen expecting a prediction or a supernatural promise. Listen as a story about timing, courage, unfinished feelings, and the strange ways love can survive inside silence. Because the person you love may not have been silent for the reason you thought. For weeks, perhaps months, there had been a distance between you. Not necessarily an argument. Not necessarily a goodbye. Something harder to define. A hesitation. Messages written and erased. Conversations that ended just before becoming honest. Long pauses after simple questions. And every time you wondered, do they still care, another part of you tried to protect your heart by answering, maybe they don't. But tonight, in this story, they are holding a letter that says otherwise. The room around them is almost completely quiet. A clock moves through another minute. A cup of coffee has gone cold beside their hand. Their phone is face down because they know that if they look at it, they might lose the courage to finish what they started. They write one sentence. Then they cross it out. They try again. This time, they don't erase anything. They write, "There are things I never told you because I was afraid you would hear them differently than I meant them." And that sentence changes the entire meaning of the silence. Because perhaps the secret was never that they stopped feeling something. Perhaps the secret was that they didn't know how to carry those feelings without exposing the most vulnerable part of themselves. You see, people sometimes disappear when they care too much, not because love has vanished, but because being understood suddenly feels more dangerous than being alone. They can handle missing someone. What they struggle with is admitting why. And this person has been struggling with that admission. They remember the last time they saw you. Maybe it was somewhere ordinary. A parking lot. A doorway. A quiet cafe. A hallway where neither of you knew whether to stay another minute. You said goodbye. They smiled. You walked away. But what you didn't see was what happened after you turned the corner. They stood there for several seconds, staring at the space where you had disappeared. They wanted to call your name. They didn't. They wanted to say, "Wait." They didn't. And that tiny decision became a memory they carried much farther than they expected. Now they are writing about it. But suddenly, something unexpected happens. They open an old drawer. Inside is something connected to you. Not a dramatic photograph or an expensive gift. Something much smaller. Something almost meaningless to anyone else. A receipt. A handwritten note. A tiny reminder from an ordinary day. They pick it up and laugh softly. Then the laugh disappears. Because they remember what happened that day. They remember the way you looked at them when you thought they weren't paying attention. They remember the question you asked. They remember the answer they gave. And for the first time, they realize the answer wasn't honest. Not completely. They had said, "I'm fine." But they weren't. They had said, "It doesn't matter." But it did. They had said, "Maybe someday." And secretly, they were hoping someday would come. That realization makes their chest tighten. They place the old keepsake beside the letter and continue writing. "I thought distance would make this easier." They stop. Then add. "It didn't." The words sit there under the light. And suddenly, the person who has spent so long trying to appear composed is no longer pretending, at least not on this page. They write about the moments they secretly replayed. The conversations they wished they could have continued. The questions they never asked. The apology they never found the courage to offer. And then they reach the part they have avoided most. Why did they hold everything back? The answer isn't another person. It isn't betrayal. It isn't some hidden event designed to shock you. It's something much more human. They were afraid. Afraid that if they told you how deeply they cared, they would lose the protection of pretending they didn't. Afraid you had already moved on. Afraid they had waited too long. Afraid your silence meant rejection. And beneath all those fears was one thought they could never completely silence. What if they still feel the same way? The pen stops. They look toward the window. Outside, the street is quiet. A distant car passes, its headlights briefly moving across the wall. They look back at the letter. For several seconds, they don't write anything. Then they turn the page. There is something on the back. A sentence they wrote days ago but couldn't bring themselves to include. Their fingers tremble slightly as they read it again. "I didn't walk away because I stopped loving you. I walked away because I didn't know whether I was worthy of being loved by you." And now the story takes a different turn. Because you may have spent all this time wondering whether they remembered you. But they have been wondering whether you remembered them. You may have thought their silence was an answer. They may have thought yours was one too. Two people, each waiting for evidence that the other still cared. Two hearts protecting themselves with the exact same misunderstanding. And tonight, one of them has finally decided to risk being the first. They fold the letter once. Then unfold it. They read it again. There is one final page. The page they have been avoiding since the beginning. They know that whatever they write there cannot be taken back. They pick up the pen. Their eyes fill with tears, but they don't look away. And beneath everything they have already confessed, they begin writing the one truth that could change what happens tomorrow. Not, "I miss you." Not, "I regret leaving." Not even, "I love you." Something more frightening. Something that explains why this letter was written now. They write the first few words. Then stop. Their phone suddenly lights up across the room. A message has arrived. They stare at the screen. For a moment, they don't breathe. Because the name appearing there is yours. And the message contains only 6 words. I need to tell you something. The person holding the letter slowly stands. They look at your message. Then at the unfinished sentence beneath the lamp. And suddenly, they understand that tomorrow may not be about discovering whether the past can return. It may be about discovering whether 2 people who misunderstood each other's silence can finally become brave enough to speak. But there is one detail you still don't know. Before your message arrived, they had already written your name at the top of the final page. And underneath it, they wrote a sentence that was never meant to be sent unless they believed, just once, that you might still be listening. They turn the page toward the light. And there, beneath your name, are the words they have been too afraid to say aloud. The story ends here for tonight. But the letter doesn't. Because the next line reveals why they chose this exact moment to finally tell you the truth and what they discovered about you that changed the way they remembered your entire story together. The room seemed to become smaller after those words appeared beneath your name. For a moment, the person holding the letter forgot about everything outside that room. The ticking clock. The faint traffic beyond the window. The untouched cup beside the lamp. Even the phone glowing with your message seemed strangely distant. They had spent so much time imagining what they would say if you ever reached out again. They had rehearsed conversations in their mind while walking alone. They had imagined your questions. They had imagined your anger. They had even imagined you saying that it was too late. But they had never imagined receiving a message from you on the exact night they finally decided to stop hiding. Their first instinct was to answer immediately. Their second was to put the phone away. That hesitation revealed something they had never understood about themselves. They weren't afraid of your response. They were afraid of what your response might awaken. Because there are moments when the heart doesn't fear rejection nearly as much as it fears hope. They slowly sat down. Then they opened the final page again. The sentence beneath your name was still there. I hope you know that none of this was because you weren't enough. They stared at it. Then, almost without realizing it, they added another line. You were the person I couldn't stop comparing every future possibility to. The pen remained suspended above the paper. That sentence felt too honest. They nearly crossed it out. But they didn't. Instead, they allowed themselves to remember the year that followed your separation. Life had continued, at least on the surface. There had been work. Responsibilities. Family gatherings. New faces. New conversations. Ordinary mornings when they convinced themselves that everything had settled into place. Yet there was always a strange little moment that returned without warning. Whenever something beautiful happened, you were the person they wanted to tell. Whenever something went wrong, they wondered what you would have said. Whenever they heard a song you once liked, they remembered a conversation they hadn't thought about in months. And that was when they finally understood something painful. Moving forward had never meant forgetting you. It had meant learning how to carry the memory without allowing it to control their life. But lately, that balance had begun to change. Something had happened. Something small. Something completely unexpected. 3 days earlier, they had walked into a bookstore. They weren't looking for anything connected to you. They weren't even thinking about you. They were simply wandering between shelves when an unfamiliar book slipped from the hands of someone standing nearby and landed at their feet. They picked it up. The stranger apologized. They smiled and handed it back. Then they noticed the title. It was the same book you had once mentioned during one of your conversations. A book they had teased you about reading. A book you had insisted they would understand one day. They almost laughed at the coincidence. Then they opened it. A sentence inside stopped them cold. Not because it predicted anything. Not because it felt supernatural. Because it described exactly what they had been doing. Holding something precious at a distance because touching it meant admitting how much it mattered. They closed the book. But they couldn't close the thought. That evening, they searched through old belongings. Not desperately. Not dramatically. Almost carefully. And eventually, they found something they had forgotten existed. A note from you. Only a few lines. Nothing romantic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet there was one sentence they had written down years earlier because it had stayed with them. You don't have to have everything figured out before you choose what matters. They read it twice. Then a third time. And suddenly, the reason for the letter became clear. They had spent years waiting until they felt certain. Waiting until they knew exactly what to say. Waiting until the timing was perfect. Waiting until fear disappeared. But fear had never disappeared. It had simply become quieter. And perhaps courage was never supposed to mean feeling nothing. Perhaps courage meant speaking while your hands were still shaking. They looked at your message again. I need to tell you something. This time, they smiled. Not because they knew what would happen. Because for the first time, they understood that uncertainty didn't automatically mean danger. They began typing. I'm here. Then deleted it. They typed. Tell me. Deleted that too. Finally, they wrote. I've been wanting to hear from you for longer than you know. Their thumb hovered over the screen. Then they stopped. Something inside them whispered that this wasn't enough. Not tonight. Not after everything they had carried. So they placed the phone beside the letter and returned to the page. They wanted you to know the truth, but not the polished version. Not the version that sounded beautiful after being edited 100 times. They wanted you to know what really happened. The night they left. The reason they didn't turn around. The conversation they had afterward. The decision they made the next morning. And that was where the story became more complicated. Because you had always believed their departure was a choice they made freely. It wasn't. There had been something happening in their life that they never told you about. Not another romance. Not a secret betrayal. Something much quieter. They had been watching someone they loved struggle through a difficult season, and they had convinced themselves that becoming emotionally distant was the responsible thing to do. They thought they were protecting you from their unfinished life. They thought they were giving you the freedom to find someone more stable. Someone less complicated. Someone who wouldn't arrive carrying a suitcase full of uncertainty. But they never realized what that decision would cost. They wrote, "I thought leaving would give you a better life." Then paused. "And I didn't realize I was making that decision for you." That sentence stayed on the page. For years, they had called it sacrifice. Tonight, they finally recognized another word for it. Fear. Fear disguised as selflessness. Fear dressed up as maturity. Fear pretending to be love. Their eyes closed. And for the first time, they admitted something they had never admitted even to themselves. They hadn't trusted you to choose them. They had decided you would eventually choose someone else. And instead of giving you the opportunity to prove them wrong, they disappeared behind their own assumptions. The realization hurt more than any argument could have. Because sometimes the deepest regret isn't something you did. It's something you prevented from ever having a chance. They picked up the phone again. Your message was still there. This time, they didn't hesitate. "I'll listen." 3 words. Then your typing indicator appeared. It vanished. Appeared again. Vanished. They watched the screen. Whatever you were trying to say was taking time. Then your message arrived. "I found something that belongs to you." Their expression changed. They stared at the sentence. Something that belongs to you? Their mind raced through possibilities. A photograph? A book? An old gift? Then another message appeared. "You left it with me the last time we saw each other." Their breathing became shallow. Because they remembered that day. They remembered almost everything. But there was one thing they had forgotten. Something they hadn't realized you had kept. They typed. "What is it?" The answer didn't come immediately. Instead, you sent a photograph. They opened it. And the room went completely still. It wasn't an object. It wasn't a photograph of the two of you. It wasn't anything they expected. It was a handwritten page. Their own handwriting. Something they had written years ago and thought they had destroyed. They zoomed in. Their eyes moved slowly across the page. And then they saw the final sentence. A sentence written on a night when they were certain you would never see it. "I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to tell you this, but if you ever find these words, please understand that leaving was never the same as letting go." Their hand covered their mouth. Because you had found the page. You had kept it. And suddenly, the person who had spent years wondering whether you remembered them was facing a truth they had never dared to imagine. You had remembered. Not only remembered. You had carried proof. They looked down at the unfinished love letter beside them. Then back at the photograph. For several seconds, neither of you sent another message. And in that silence, something shifted. Not because the past had magically disappeared. Not because everything was suddenly forgiven. But because two people who had spent years interpreting each other's silence were finally looking at the same truth. They had both been waiting. The person holding the letter wiped their eyes and began writing again. This time, there was no hesitation. They wrote about the morning after they left. They wrote about the sentence they wished they had said. They wrote about the moment they almost came back. And then they reached the part they had buried deepest. The part they had never told anyone. They remembered standing outside your door. Not once. Twice. They had come back. They had stood there. They had even raised their hand to knock. But they heard voices inside. They misunderstood what they heard. And they walked away believing something that wasn't true. Now, years later, they finally knew the truth. The voices they heard that night were not what they thought. The person they feared had replaced them wasn't there for the reason they imagined. And the decision that changed both your lives had been built upon a misunderstanding that lasted far too long. They stared at the page. Then wrote the sentence they had been avoiding. That night, I was standing outside your door. They stopped. Their fingers tightened around the pen. Then they continued. And I heard you say my name. Their heart began pounding. Because there was one more detail. One detail you had never known. They hadn't walked away immediately. They had stayed outside long enough to hear what you said next. And what you said next was the reason they had never truly stopped loving you. But before they could write it down, your next message appeared. Only 4 words. I know you were there. They froze. The letter slipped from their fingers. Because if you knew they had been standing outside that night, then there was only one question left. How much had you actually seen? And why had you waited all these years to tell them that you knew? They looked at the final blank space on the page. For the first time, they realized the letter wasn't leading toward a goodbye. It was leading toward a conversation neither of you had been brave enough to have. They began writing one final sentence for the night. But before the ink reached the end, your phone lit up again. This time, your message contained a confession of your own. And it began with the words. There is something you never knew about that night. To be continued. My beloved child. The message remained on the screen, bright against the darkness. There is something you never knew about that night. The person holding the phone read it once. Then again. Then a third time, as if the meaning might change if they stared long enough. It didn't. Their memories returned in fragments. The cold air outside your door, the dim hallway, the sound of voices behind the wall, the unbearable decision to leave without knocking. For years, they had carried one version of that night. Now you were offering another. Their fingers moved across the keyboard. What didn't I know? They waited. No answer. Another minute passed. Then another. The silence became almost unbearable, until finally 3 dots appeared beneath your name. They disappeared. Returned. Then vanished again. Whoever was on the other side was struggling to say something that had survived years of silence. At last, your message arrived. You weren't the only one who came back that night. They sat perfectly still. The sentence seemed impossible. You continued before they could respond. I was waiting for you. Their eyes closed. For one brief moment, the entire room seemed to lose its sound. The clock was still moving. The city outside was still alive. But inside that small room, the past had suddenly become present. Realized something was wrong. You had known their goodbye hadn't sounded like a normal goodbye. There had been something unfinished in their voice, something carefully hidden beneath ordinary words. So you went looking for them. You returned to the place where you had last spoken. They weren't there. You called. No answer. You waited. Nothing. Eventually, you returned home. And that was when you saw the person they had mistaken for someone important in your life. But the truth was completely different. That person had been there because you had asked for help. You had been preparing something. Not a replacement. Not a new beginning. Something meant for them. A small celebration. A surprise. A way of telling them that despite everything happening around you, you had chosen them. The person reading your message stared at the screen in disbelief. For years, they had believed they were walking away from a future that no longer included them. In reality, you had been preparing to invite them deeper into your life. The cruelest part wasn't that either of you had stopped caring. It was that both of you had been making decisions based on information neither of you possessed. You sent another message. I wanted to tell you that night. Then. But when you didn't come inside, I thought you had already made your decision. Their hand tightened around the phone. They whispered your name into an empty room. Not as a question. Not as a plea. As recognition. The pieces were beginning to connect. The old letter. The unfinished conversation. The mysterious person outside. The years of distance. The assumptions. And then you sent the sentence that changed everything. I waited until midnight. They remembered that night. They remembered walking away. They remembered telling themselves they were doing the right thing. But they had never known that while they were standing outside your door, you were watching the same night unfold from the other side. Two people separated by one door. One decision. One misunderstanding. And years of consequences. They put the phone down. Then stood. They walked to the window and looked into the darkness. For the first time, they didn't feel angry at the past. They felt grief for the younger versions of both of you. The two people who had loved each other with imperfect information. The two people who believed protecting themselves was wiser than asking one more question. And suddenly, they understood why your message had arrived tonight. You weren't trying to resurrect yesterday. You were trying to stop yesterday from controlling tomorrow. That distinction changed everything. They returned to the letter. The page was still open. The ink had dried. At the bottom, there was enough space for one final paragraph. They began writing. I wish I could say I was brave back then. They paused. Then continued. I wasn't. There was no dramatic excuse after that. No attempt to make themselves look noble. Just honesty. I thought love meant knowing when to leave. I didn't understand that sometimes love means staying long enough to hear the answer. They read the sentence slowly. Then added something they had never been able to admit. I didn't need you to promise me forever. I needed one honest conversation. The room grew quiet again. But this silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that comes after a truth finally finds somewhere safe to land. Then your name appeared on the screen. You were calling. Their heart jumped. For years, they had imagined hearing your voice again. Now that moment was actually happening. Their finger hovered over the answer button. And suddenly, another fear appeared. What if your voice sounded different? What if you had changed? What if the person they remembered existed only in their memory? What if this conversation gave them closure instead of another chance? They almost let the call end. Then they remembered the letter. They remembered how many times fear had already made decisions for them. They answered. Neither of you spoke. There was only breathing. Two people listening to the sound of each other after years of absence. Finally, you said their name. Softly. Not dramatically. Just their name. And that was enough to break the wall they had spent so long building. They laughed once, almost nervously. You laughed too. Then you said, I didn't know if you would answer. They looked down. I didn't know if I deserved to. There was a pause. Then your voice became quieter. That isn't what I called to ask. They waited. You continued. I called because I found something else. Their expression changed. Something else? You told them that after finding the old page, you had searched through a box of things you hadn't opened in years. Inside was a photograph. Not of the two of you. It was a photograph of a place. A place neither of you had visited together. But underneath the photograph was a date. The same date as the night they left. They asked why you had kept it. Your answer was almost a whisper. Because that was supposed to be our next chapter. Their chest tightened. You explained. Before everything fell apart, you had been planning to ask them to meet you there. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't some grand cinematic gesture. It was simpler. You wanted a fresh beginning somewhere neither of you had memories of being hurt. A place where the past couldn't tell the story for you. But they never came. So you kept the photograph. Not as a promise. As evidence of a life that almost happened. They asked where the place was. You told them. Then came the question neither of you had expected. Do you still have it? You were silent. Yes. The answer landed differently than everything before it. Because now the mystery wasn't whether love had existed. You both knew it had. The mystery was whether something could be rebuilt after so much time had passed. They looked at the letter again. There were tears on the page now, blurring the edges of the handwriting. They said, I don't want to pretend we can erase everything. I don't either, you replied. I don't want us to become who we were. Another pause. Neither do I. And somehow, that was the most hopeful thing either of you had said. Because neither of you was asking to go backward. You were asking whether two changed people could meet again without demanding that the past disappear. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. You spoke about the years apart. The things you had learned. The mistakes you regretted. The dreams that had changed. The parts of yourselves that had grown stronger. And eventually, you reached the question both of you had avoided. Why now? You didn't answer immediately. Instead, you said something that made them sit upright. Because tomorrow is the day I was going to throw the letter away. They looked at the page. What letter? Your voice softened. The one I wrote to you. They stopped breathing for a moment. You explained that you had written your own letter years ago. You had never sent it. You had carried it through different apartments, different seasons, different versions of your life. You had nearly destroyed it more than once. But you kept it. And tomorrow, you had decided, would finally be the day you let it go. Not because you stopped caring. Because you believed the story was finished. Then tonight, something unexpected happened. You found their old handwritten page. And suddenly, the decision became impossible. They asked, "What does your letter say?" You didn't answer. Instead, you said, "If I read it to you, you can't interrupt." They smiled through their tears. Okay. There was a long pause. Then paper moved near your microphone. You had opened it. The letter was old. The edges were worn. Your voice trembled as you began reading. I don't know where you are tonight. They closed their eyes. You continued. I don't know whether you still remember the sound of my voice, or whether I became just another chapter you learned to live without. Their eyes filled again. But then your voice changed. Because the next sentence wasn't about the past. It was about the future. And the words you read next were so unexpected that they slowly stood from their chair. You said, "If you ever come back into my life, I don't want you to come back as the person who left." They waited. You took a breath. I want you to come back as the person who finally understands why I stayed. The room went completely silent. They looked at the letter they had written. Then at the clock. Tomorrow was approaching. But there was still one thing neither of you had said. One question remained between the two of you. And after everything that had been revealed, it was the only question that mattered. You finally asked it. Not about the years apart. Not about the old misunderstanding. Not about who had been right or wrong. You asked whether they were willing to meet you at the place in the photograph. Tomorrow. They looked at the date. They looked at your name. And then they realized why the title of their own letter had always felt unfinished. They had written it as though they were saying goodbye. But somewhere in the middle of the night, the meaning had changed. The letter wasn't an ending. It was an invitation. They reached for the pen one final time and wrote beneath everything else. I'll be there. But just before they sent the message, your voice came through the phone again. Wait. They stopped. You sounded different now. More serious. Almost frightened. There is one more thing you need to know before you come. They lowered the pen. What? You were silent for several seconds. Then you said something that neither of you had ever discussed. Something connected to the reason you had originally written that secret letter. Something that could change what tomorrow's meeting would mean. And when they finally heard it, they realized the story wasn't only about the two of you finding each other again. It was about a choice you had been preparing to make long before tonight. A choice you had kept hidden because you were afraid that if they knew the truth, they might come back for the wrong reason. Then your final words came through the phone. "I need you to understand why I almost stopped waiting." The call went quiet. The pen remained motionless. And for the first time that night, the person holding the letter wasn't wondering whether you still loved them. They were wondering what you had been carrying alone all these years. Tomorrow was no longer simply a meeting. It was the moment when the last secret would finally be spoken. And neither of you knew yet whether that truth would open the door to a new beginning, or finally give both of you the courage to close the one that had remained open for far too long. "My beloved child." The question remained between them long after the call became silent. "I need you to understand why I almost stopped waiting." The words didn't sound like an accusation. They sounded like exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying something precious for so long that even hope begins to feel heavy. The person holding the letter didn't answer immediately. They understood that this wasn't the moment to defend themselves. It wasn't the moment to promise things they couldn't guarantee. So they simply said, "Tell me." On the other end, you took a slow breath. Then you explained. You hadn't almost stopped waiting because you stopped caring. You almost stopped waiting because you finally realized that your life couldn't remain suspended around a question that had no answer. You had continued living. You had built routines. You had laughed again. You had made plans. You had learned to enjoy ordinary mornings without wondering whether someone from the past might return. And that frightened you. Not because happiness was wrong, but because part of you had believed that moving forward meant betraying what you once felt. Eventually, you understood something important. Loving someone and waiting endlessly for them were not the same thing. You could honor what happened without allowing it to prevent what might happen next. That was why tomorrow mattered. Not because destiny demanded it. Not because some invisible force had guaranteed an outcome. Tomorrow mattered because both of you finally had something you didn't have years ago. The freedom to choose honestly. The person holding the letter looked down. For years, they had secretly believed they needed to earn their way back into your life. Now they understood that wasn't the question. You weren't asking them to prove they deserved you. You were asking whether they were capable of meeting you as you were now. Not as the person they remembered. Not as the person they imagined. You had changed. So had they. And perhaps that was the real reason the old love had survived. It wasn't waiting for the past to return. It was waiting for the truth to become stronger than the fear that had separated you. You finally told them what had been hidden inside your letter. You had written it on the night you realized they weren't coming back. You had written everything you couldn't say aloud. The anger. The tenderness. The disappointment. The gratitude. The questions. And, at the very bottom, one sentence you had never shown anyone. I would rather know the truth than spend another year inventing answers. They closed their eyes. That sentence struck deeper than any declaration of love could have. Because it explained what both of you had been missing. Not affection. Not memories. Truth. You had both spent years creating explanations for each other's behavior because asking the difficult question felt too frightening. Now there was nowhere left to hide. They told you about the night outside your door. Everything. They told you what they had heard. What they had assumed. Why they left. Why they never returned. Then came the part that hurt the most. They admitted that they had convinced themselves your silence meant you didn't want them. You answered softly. I thought yours meant the same thing. Neither of you spoke. There was no dramatic music. No perfect sentence. Just two people finally hearing the truth they should have heard years ago. And somehow, that was enough. The next morning arrived quietly. There was no miracle waiting outside the window. No sudden sign from the heavens. Just sunlight spreading across a familiar room. The letter was still on the table. The ink was dry. The final sentence remained unfinished. They folded the page carefully and placed it inside an envelope. Not because the story was over. Because they wanted to give it to you in person. Then they left. Across town, you were doing the same. You had your own letter. The old photograph. The worn page they had once written. And a small box containing the object you had planned to give them years ago. You almost laughed when you looked at it. All those years. All that distance. And the answer had been sitting in a box the entire time. Neither of you knew what would happen when you met. That was important. Because for once, neither of you was trying to control the ending. You simply agreed to arrive. The place in the photograph was quieter than either of you remembered. A small overlook above the city. Trees moving gently in the morning wind. A bench beneath an old shade tree. The kind of place where people went when they wanted to think. You arrived first. Your hands were cold. You checked the time. Then looked down the road. And there they were. For a second, neither of you moved. Years disappeared without actually disappearing. You could still see the younger version of them somewhere inside the person walking toward you. And they could see the younger version of you in the way you stood there, nervous and hopeful and trying not to show either. When they finally reached you, neither of you knew what to say. So you smiled. They smiled. And then you laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes the heart doesn't know what else to do when something impossible suddenly becomes real. They handed you the envelope. You handed them yours. Neither opened the other's letter immediately. You sat together instead. You talked. Not about forever. Not about promises. Not about whether the past could be repaired perfectly. You talked about who you had become. What you had learned. What you feared. What you wanted now. And slowly, something beautiful happened. You stopped trying to recover the relationship you once had. You began discovering the people you had become. That distinction changed everything. Eventually, you opened their letter. The words were honest. There were no grand claims. No attempt to rewrite history. Only an apology for the choices they had made from fear, gratitude for the love they had once received, and a simple request. If there is room in your life for me now, I would like to earn a place there honestly. You looked at them. Then opened your own letter. Inside, they found the sentence that had survived all those years. I never needed you to return as the person I lost. I only hoped that one day you would return as someone willing to stay when things became difficult. Their eyes filled. They looked at you. I think I finally understand. You shook your head gently. No. They looked surprised. You smiled. You don't have to understand everything today. And that was the moment the weight lifted. Because love was no longer being treated like a test. There was no deadline. No demand for certainty. No promise that everything would magically become easy. There was simply a beginning. A real one. Slow. Honest. Uncertain. But chosen. The old photograph remained between you on the bench. You looked at it and realized something. The place in the photograph had never been important because it represented a future that didn't happen. It was important because it represented a future that could be reconsidered. Not repeated. Reconsidered. You didn't need to become the people you were that night. You only needed to stop allowing that night to make every decision for you. The person you loved looked toward the horizon. Then asked, "Do you still want to go?" You knew exactly what they meant. Not leave. Not disappear. Go forward. You smiled. Yes. And this time, neither of you needed to guess what the other meant. You stood together. The letters were safely tucked away. The old misunderstandings had finally been spoken aloud. The unanswered questions had finally found answers. And the secret love letter that had begun as a confession of regret had become something else entirely. Proof that sometimes the most important message isn't the one that tells you someone loves you. It is the one that reminds you that love without honesty can become a prison of assumptions. And honesty, even when it arrives late, can still open a door. Maybe that is the lesson hidden inside this fictional story. Sometimes people don't leave because they don't care. Sometimes they leave because they don't know how to stay. Sometimes someone isn't silent because they have forgotten you. Sometimes they are silent because they are fighting a private battle you cannot see. And sometimes, the answer you have been waiting for isn't another person's return. It is your own permission to stop living inside an unanswered question. The future belongs to neither the person who waits forever nor the person who runs forever. It belongs to the person who becomes brave enough to communicate, to listen, to forgive what can be forgiven, and to release what cannot. The two of you walked away from that overlook without knowing exactly what the next year would look like. And strangely, that uncertainty felt peaceful. There was no need to force the ending. You had already received something more valuable. The truth. Years later, if you ever looked back on that morning, you might realize the miracle wasn't that two people found each other again. The miracle was that they finally stopped making decisions for each other. They stopped assuming. They stopped pretending. They stopped confusing fear with wisdom. And they chose to speak. That is where the real love story began. Not with the letter. Not with the reunion. Not even with the years of longing. It began the moment both hearts became honest enough to say, "This is who I am now. This is what happened. This is what I feel. And if we continue, let it be because we choose each other freely." So if this story found a quiet place inside you, don't rush to decide what it means. Let it remind you that your worth isn't measured by who stays, who leaves, who returns, or who writes your name on a page. You are worthy of communication that doesn't leave you guessing. You are worthy of affection that doesn't require you to abandon yourself. You are worthy of relationships where truth is spoken with tenderness and where your heart doesn't have to constantly decode silence. And if someone from your past returns, remember this story. Don't ask only whether they still love you. Ask whether both of you have learned how to love differently. Ask whether the old wounds have become wisdom. Ask whether there is room for honesty. Ask whether the future deserves a chance to become something new instead of simply repeating what came before. And if nobody returns, that doesn't mean your story failed. Sometimes the closing of one chapter creates the space where your deepest peace can finally begin. May your heart become lighter. May the words you have been afraid to speak find their way into the right conversations. May you have the wisdom to recognize genuine love without chasing what only resembles it. May you forgive yourself for the moments when fear made decisions for you. May you never mistake someone's silence for a measurement of your value. And may tomorrow bring you clarity, not necessarily the answer you expected, but the answer that helps you walk forward with peace. If someone you love came to mind while listening to this story, perhaps let that feeling remind you of one simple thing: love deserves honesty, but your heart deserves peace too. And if this message touched something inside you, stay connected to this channel for more fictional spiritual stories about love, healing, hope, and the hidden conversations of the heart. If you want, share in the comments one word that describes what your heart needs right now. Maybe someone reading it needs that same word. And before you leave, remember this. You do not have to chase what is meant to meet you with honesty. You do not have to remain trapped inside yesterday. You do not have to know every chapter before you take the next step. Sometimes the most beautiful beginning comes after you finally stop asking the past to explain your future. Take a breath. Let your heart rest. Tomorrow is still unwritten. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of all.